They thought he was just the janitor's son, until his pendulum fell sideways and never came back. And with that, one of the laws of the world began to bend. It was colder than usual that evening in Boston. The steam that hissed from the underground grates rose in slow, ghost-like clouds, drifting along the feet of those who never stopped to notice. On the cracked concrete paths behind MIT's physics wing, the sun had long since dropped behind the chapel, and the lights overhead buzzed with that distant hum of fluorescent fatigue. Behind Building 3A, through a narrow metal door with peeling gray paint, sat a room that had no name, only a number stenciled faintly in faded ink. Storage 24. Elias Walker lived there. He had no student ID, no enrollment file, no desk in any classroom. But every night, after the last lecture emptied out, Elias cleaned the floors alongside his father, Daniel Walker, the overnight janitor. Together they swept the halls, polished the rails, and pushed silence back into the corners before dawn came. Each morning, Elias snuck into empty lecture rooms. He never sat near the front, always in the back, in the shadows. No notebook, no laptop, just a stillness in his gaze. And somehow, he remembered everything. Not like a machine records data, but like a farmer remembers which row of soil softens first after rain. One morning, long before the world was awake, Elias stood in front of the large pendulum inside the old demonstration room. 7 meters of taut steel wire with a black weight heavy as regret, cutting perfect arcs across the floor. "The professor said if there's no resistance," Elias whispered, "it'll swing forever." His father spoke from the corner of the room, wiping dust off a light switch. "What if it doesn't come back?" Elias didn't answer. But that night, something changed. For the first time in his 17 years, he built a pendulum of his own, not with steel, with old rope from the storage shed. The weight? A rusted padlock once used on a broken gate. He didn't calculate, didn't measure. He just let it swing. And then, carefully, he marked each point the rope touched the ground with a piece of chalk. When he stood back, he saw something strange. The arc was crooked. Not from wind, not from error. The pendulum had shifted, slightly, subtly, but it did not return to its start. Not because it failed, but because it remembered. He drew it again, this time in dirt, using the heel of his boot. A spiral, imperfect but deliberate, as if gravity was not a fixed rule, but a habit formed over time. As if balance wasn't a goal, but a story. Elias didn't call it a discovery. He didn't have the language for that. All he knew was that something in the world had leaned, and no one had seen it but him. The first time Elias walked into MIT's main lecture hall, no one noticed. He sat low in the back row where the lights didn't quite reach, boots dusty from the boiler room. On the stage stood Professor Raymond Morrow, the man whose lectures had shaped thousands of physics students across 3 continents. He'd published 2 seminal papers on oscillation stability. His voice was crisp, controlled, like someone used to silence when he spoke. On the board behind him, he drew a classic model of harmonic motion, a sine wave, clean and centered. "This," he said, "is the return to equilibrium. Always. Regardless of disruption." Elias raised his eyes and raised his hand. Not high, not fast, just enough. The professor paused, frowning. "Yes, in the back." Elias spoke quietly. His voice cracked from dust and cold. "What if gravity isn't fixed but reactive? What if it remembers motion? Then maybe equilibrium isn't always the place things return to?" A laugh broke out near the front. One student turned around and shouted, "Gravity with memory? What's next? Emotional pendulums?" Even the professor allowed a dry smile. Gravity doesn't remember, young man. Only people do, and sometimes poorly. Elias said nothing more. But as he stared at the diagram, he saw it again. The tilt, the pattern, the same misalignment his homemade pendulum had shown. If the swing shifted just slightly, if the midpoint was allowed to wander, the system wouldn't collapse. It would evolve. That night, Elias didn't return to storage 24. He returned to the corner of the old testing yard, where broken bricks and wire coils were dumped behind the lab. And there, in the cold, he rebuilt the pendulum, only this time with a double-length rope and a second point of anchor. He didn't pull it straight. He let it lean. The arc it drew was not symmetrical, not clean, but it didn't fall apart. It bent. Then it bent again. And each new swing echoed the one before, not as repetition, but as memory. Daniel Walker watched from a distance, his hands rough and cracked from bleach and winter. "You're not writing this down," he said. Elias shook his head. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he whispered. "I'm trying to hear what it's saying." His father came closer, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your mother used to say soil remembers the footsteps of the one who feeds it," he said. "Maybe physics is just dirt with more rules." That night, Elias opened the old cloth-bound notebook that once belonged to his mother. He wrote in small letters, "If motion remembers, then stability is not a center. It is the place where the world accepts the lean." And that was the night. A boy who had never touched chalk in front of a class began to bend the first law of the world. 3 nights passed. Elias didn't draw the spiral again, not on paper, not in soil. He watched it live, in the way the rope swung when no one else looked, in the way the arc shifted slightly each time. It was no longer a theory. It had become a rhythm, a breath. But breath means nothing in a room full of breathless minds, and MIT's South Hall, room 4B, was just that. A sealed chamber of thought, vacuumed clean of intuition. It was there that Elias first crossed paths with Trevor Lang, a senior research fellow in applied motion systems. Polished hair, tighter tie, tighter smile. Trevor walked like someone who had already written his resume for awards not yet invented. He had seen Elias before, sweeping under the lab tables, emptying the bins before lectures. But he'd never spoken to him, not until the day he wandered into Storage 24 looking for a misplaced box of magnetic wire. He stopped in the doorway, because on the floor, drawn in chalk, was a spiral. Imperfect, uneven, but undeniably deliberate. Elias was crouched beside it, adjusting the weight on a pendulum made of rope and a lead pipe. He didn't look up. Trevor stepped in. "What is this?" he asked, almost amused. Elias stood. "It's not done." Trevor walked slowly around the spiral, hands in his coat pockets. "It's unbalanced." "Yes," Elias said. "It leans, like memory." Trevor narrowed his eyes. "Memory doesn't exist in oscillation theory." Elias tilted his head. "Not in theory." Trevor was quiet for a beat. Then, almost gently, he said, "You know, sometimes strange ideas need stronger voices." He didn't ask permission. He didn't take notes. He just stared at the spiral for another 20 seconds, then left. He never mentioned the encounter again. But 2 weeks later, Elias noticed a new poster on the announcement board near the lab elevator. Graduate Colloquium, Novel Approaches to Oscillatory Systems. Presenter, Trevor Lang. Topic, Spiral Deviation in Equilibrium Seeking Structures. There was a sketch. It was his spiral, almost exactly, only neater, smoother, and credited to no one. Elias attended the talk. He sat in the back again, not out of fear, but out of custom. The room was full, postdocs, faculty, 2 visiting researchers from Zurich. Trevor stood at the podium, pointer in hand, confidence polished like glass. "What we observe," he said, gesturing to the slide, "is a non-linear shift in the return path of the pendulum, suggesting either an external disturbance or an internal memory loop embedded in the swing." Someone raised a hand. "What's the model based on?" "Field observation," Trevor replied. "Improvised physical prototype. Anonymous source." Elias didn't move. Anonymous. As if truth had no fingerprint. Later that night, Elias returned to Storage 24. The spiral on the floor had been smudged by a janitor's cart. Not his father's, but one of the newer workers. The rope was coiled in the corner, limp. The weight sat off to one side, as if ashamed of itself. His father was in the hallway, hunched over a busted heater, hands dark with grease. "You look like something cracked," he said. Elias stared at the floor. He took it. The spiral said it was anonymous. The old man leaned back against the wall, wiped his brow. "Son, truth don't care who signs it, but liars do." Elias didn't answer. He didn't sleep that night. He rebuilt the spiral outside, in the gravel yard behind the biology annex where no one came. This time, he made it wrong on purpose. One curve reversed. One turn too shallow. He wanted to see if Trevor could fix it. The next morning, the spiral had been touched, smoothed, adjusted, but not corrected. Because you can't fix what you never understood. Trevor had tried, but the shift was not just a shape. It was a sequence of motion, a memory loop. Without the walk, the breath, the lean, the spiral collapsed into a lie. 2 days later, Elias returned to room 4B. Trevor was in the middle of a demo with 3 faculty members. One of them was Professor Morrow, the same man who'd dismissed Elias weeks earlier. There was a small pendulum on the table now, machine precision, calibrated, with sensors logging every swing. Elias entered without knocking. No one noticed at first. Then Trevor turned, startled. Elias walked to the board and, without asking, picked up a piece of chalk. He didn't speak. He drew. A pendulum path, but not a circle, not a sine wave, a spiral. Then he drew the deviation, then the delay, then the return, not to center, but to the memory of the last lean. Trevor stepped forward. "That's not the model we submitted," he said sharply. "I know," Elias replied, "because the model you submitted doesn't work without the soil." Professor Morrow folded his arms. "So what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Walker?" Elias said. "I propose that some systems don't seek balance. They remember imbalance." The room fell silent. Then Morrow asked, "Where's your data?" Elias walked to his satchel, pulled out the only thing he had, a piece of rope. He tied it to a chair leg, hung the weight. Then slowly, he walked the spiral, one step at a time. He didn't swing the pendulum. He let it move with him. The curve formed, imperfect, wobbling, alive. Trevor scoffed. "So this is your proof?" "No," Elias said. "This is its memory." That night, he returned to the field outside campus. He built a new spiral in the grass, using string and metal washers. He didn't write anything down. But the ground held the shape, and somewhere far away, in a clean lab with equations on screens, Trevor Lang tried to replicate the motion again. He failed, because some knowledge doesn't live in formulas, It breathes, and only those who walk with it, step by step, ever hear it speak. Clara Whitmore had never failed a translation, not from one language to another, not from thought to theorem, not from observation to equation. Daughter of a physics professor, granddaughter of a mathematician, grew up solving puzzles at the dinner table, proving lemmas before learning to drive. And yet, on a quiet Tuesday evening, sitting alone in the corner of the campus library, she faced the first thing she couldn't flatten: a spiral drawn in dirt. Not by a scientist, by a boy in flannel boots who had never seen a lecture from the front row. And yet his spiral breathed. It moved wrong, which is to say, it moved in a way no formula she knew could hold still. Clara had seen Elias once before, the day he walked out of room 4B without waiting for applause. He didn't need it. He hadn't asked to be heard. That's what made it worse, and more powerful. She had followed him outside, quietly, without him knowing. What she saw was this: a piece of rope, a lead weight, a spiral traced in dirt, and a boy kneeling beside it, not to teach it, not to study it, but to listen. Clara snapped a photo. She didn't know why, not until later that night, when she uploaded it to her laptop, overlaid axis lines, and tried to fit it to any standard function: polar curves, logarithmic spirals, parametric waveforms. None fit. The more she tried to make it behave, the more it refused. It was not chaos. It was memory, in motion. The next morning, Clara skipped her scheduled seminar on discrete systems and instead sat at her dorm desk, headphones in, whirled off. She printed the spiral, traced it again, this time by hand. Each curve was slightly different, just enough to whisper a question. What if the system isn't flawed? What if it's remembering? She wrote notes in the margins. Too alive for static math motion isn't repeating. It's adapting. This isn't an error. It's a hesitation with rhythm. Her equations kept failing. They couldn't accept deviation without forcing it back to center. But the spiral wasn't trying to center. It was adjusting, leaning, holding, learning. At 2:12 a.m., Clara wrote the sentence that would define her for the next 3 years. Mathematics tries to control it, but the spiral doesn't want to be controlled. 3 days later, she biked to the edge of campus, to the field behind the maintenance sheds. He was there, as she guessed he would be. Hammering a loose hinge onto a gate, sleeves rolled, eyes narrowed in thought. "Hey!" she called out. Elias looked up, nodded once. She held up her notebook, open to the spiral sketch. "I tried to model it." He wiped his hands on his jeans. "Did it work?" She shook her head. "Every time I smoothed it, it stopped working." Elias didn't look surprised. "It doesn't like smooth." She sat on the ground beside the coil of rope he'd used last week. "I think the wobble is the model." Elias glanced at her, then back at the earth. "Most things out here don't move clean. Cows don't walk in straight lines. Water doesn't flow in formulas. Maybe models should wobble too." Clara frowned. "But how do I write that?" "You don't." He picked up the rope again. "You walk it." They spent the afternoon tracing the spiral, again and again across the field. Clara didn't record data. She just watched. The pattern wasn't clean, but it was consistent in its inconsistency. Each turn leaned slightly left, then corrected, but not fully. Like breath. Like grief. Like memory replaying the shape of a past misstep, not to erase it, but to honor it. At dusk, Clara pulled a small recorder from her bag. "I want to try something," she said. Elias nodded. She asked, "What's the first thing you noticed about the spiral?" He answered, that it didn't try to return. She asked, "And why do you think it holds?" He said, "Because the ground remembers where I've already been." She clicked the recorder off. For the first time in her life, Clara felt math listening back. That night, back in her room, Clara began writing a new paper. Not for class, not for credit. For something deeper. She titled it, Walker Spiral, a Model of Memory in Motion, Unformalized. She didn't use equations. She used instructions. Anchor one point. Let the next step lean. Do not correct. Observe the return. If it bends, mark the bend. If it holds, let it hold. At the bottom of the page, she wrote, Spiral not defined by shape. Spiral defined by refusal to forget. The next morning, a folded note was slid under Elias's door. No name. Inside, a single line. Open research session, room 3C. Student contributions. Welcome topic. Alternative framings in oscillation systems. It wasn't signed, but he knew who left it. Clara. Elias showed the note to his father that night. Daniel Walker read it slowly, eyes narrowing. You planning to go? Maybe, Elias said. Planning to speak? Don't know. His father stood, stretched, then handed him an old hand-carved handle, a part of a broken fence post, smooth from time. If you do, he said, speak loud enough that even the ones who don't want to listen have to stop. Elias didn't promise anything. He folded the note into his pocket, went out to the field, and walked the spiral one more time, barefoot, letting the ground remind him where it had leaned last time. It was the kind of room where truth usually dressed in formulas. Room 3C of the Applied Physics Annex. The walls pale, the whiteboard too clean, the air smelling faintly of dry markers and filtered silence. It wasn't a lecture hall, just a seminar room with 20 chairs, all facing forward, all waiting for someone important to speak. But on that morning, it wasn't someone important who entered first. It was Elias Walker. He stepped through the door just after 8 o'clock a.m., wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn while fixing the south gate latch the week before. His boots were clean, scrubbed with a wire brush until the soil gave up its grip, but the soles still carried the memory of where they'd walked. Under one arm, a cardboard box. No laptop, no binder, no laser pointer, just rope, wooden stakes, and a coil of bent wire. He nodded once to Clara, who was already seated in the corner, notebook open, face calm but eyes alert. She gave a small smile, the kind that says you're not alone, even if no one else knows it yet. More students entered, then 2 teaching fellows, then a man in a gray blazer who checked his watch too often. Whispers followed. Isn't that the janitor's kid? He's got rope in that box. Maybe he's lost? Maybe this is a prank. Elias said nothing. He sat in the back, waited. At 8:15 sharp, a graduate assistant stepped to the front and cleared her throat. We're here today for open contributions on alternative models of oscillation and system framing, she said. Think of this as a space for exploration, not examination. She looked around. Any volunteers? The room was quiet, until a chair scraped against the floorboards. Elias stood, box in hand. He walked slowly to the front, not to perform, not to impress. But like a farmer walking a fence line, deliberate, grounded. He set the box down, opened it, and from inside pulled a spiral, not a drawing, not a diagram. A physical spiral, made of bent wire, string, and 3 wooden pegs held together by knots. It wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Elias set it gently on the table like planting a seed. Then he turned to face the room. "This isn't math yet," he began, voice steady, rough at the edges like sanded wood. "But it's thinking." A pause. He rotated the spiral slightly. "It shifts every turn, not by accident, by memory. Each curve remembers the one before it." Silence. He picked up a marker, drew a curve on the board, one line, then a bend, then a second bend in a slightly different place, then dots along the way like footprints veering sideways. "This," he said, "isn't a flaw. It's a path. When you walk a spiral like this, you're not returning. You're echoing." A voice cut through the quiet. Julian Park, second-year PhD, well-respected, impeccably groomed. "Are you suggesting this model can solve known equations?" Elias shook his head. "No. I'm saying some equations are afraid of this." A ripple in the room, shifting legs, raised eyebrows. Then came another voice, colder, sharper. Trevor Lang, pressed blazer, perfect posture, practiced confidence. "If this spiral is meaningful," he asked, arms crossed, "then where's the data?" Elias looked at him. "Where's the analysis, the regression, the proof?" "You built a spiral with your feet," Trevor said. "We build systems with logic." The room nodded, quietly, but with weight. Elias didn't flinch. "You ever chase a cow through mud, Trevor?" he asked softly. The question hung there, ridiculous to some, riveting to others. "What?" "You ever feel how the ground bends under pressure? How a hoof sinks, then pulls, then twists back?" Trevor blinked. "We're in a seminar, not a barn." Elias turned back to the board. "And that's why your models collapse when the world leans sideways." The moderator coughed. "Let's keep things civil." Clara raised her hand. "I'd like to share something." All eyes turned. She stood, walked to the front, holding a single printout. "I ran Elias's spiral through a dynamic feedback model," she said. "Here's the baseline." She laid the sheet on the table, a standard curve, clean, mathematical, until it collapsed at iteration 18. Then she laid down a second sheet. "Same model," she said, "but with spiral inputs." The curve held, not straight, not flat, but stable, like breath adapting to pressure. "With the spiral," Clara said, "the system didn't break, it breathed." She looked at Trevor. "You call it dirt, but maybe your math just isn't grounded enough." The room went quiet, not politely, but intellectually. Even Trevor stepped back, uncertainty touching the corners of his eyes. Then, from the far side of the room, a new voice spoke. Low, measured, professional. "I'd like to see the model, please." All heads turned. The speaker was a man with gray hair, sharp eyes, and a notebook filled with clean, slanted handwriting. No one knew he was coming. He stepped forward. "Dr. Emmett Dale," he said. "Systems theory. I've written 3 papers on bounded spirals and failure states." He picked up Elias's wire spiral, ran his hand along it slowly. "This is ugly," he said. Another silence. He looked up. "Imprecise, unrefined, unstable." He paused. "And entirely worth pursuing." After the session, Elias didn't stay for questions, or praise, or rebuttals. He packed the spiral into the box. Clara walked beside him down the hall. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded once. "I wasn't there to win." She hesitated. "Think you made a dent?" He stopped, glanced back at room 3C. "I didn't hit the wall," he said. "I just made it echo." That night, Back at the edge of the Walker farm, Elias walked barefoot into the field behind the barn. The ground was soft, the wind low. He drew the spiral again, not with wire, not with chalk, with his steps. 5 loops. Wider at the edge, tighter at the heart. No one saw, but the earth remembered. The email came quietly, not to Elias, to Dr. Emmett Dale. It arrived after midnight from a secure university server. No subject line, no signature. Just one sentence. The spiral destabilized the containment loop at iteration 11. Not a failure, a realignment. Attached was a simulation file, old code, clunky interface, but the result was undeniable. Dale sat up straighter in his chair, because what he saw wasn't theoretical anymore. It was a shift, a lean, a crack in something too old, too trusted to question out loud. He picked up his phone and called someone he hadn't spoken to in 12 years. Her voice answered, clipped and sharp. Braina Clean. Braina Clean had a mind like cold iron, a fractal theorist, unforgiving with error, unimpressed by novelty. She had co-authored the framework that underpinned dozens of modern stability models, from urban traffic algorithms to thermal containment systems in orbital stations. Dale sent her the spiral. She opened it, watched it wobble, then frowned. It's not elegant. Dale didn't argue. But it held. Clean ran the simulation again, slower. The spiral swayed, then stabilized. Not by correcting, but by remembering the last deviation. By the 4th loop, it leaned where it had leaned before, and held the memory as part of the shape. Clean leaned back in her chair. If this is right, she said, we've been modeling the wrong return path for 20 years. By morning, they had tested the spiral's logic across 4 foundational systems. Thermal load equalization in compressed environments, rotational damping in fluid systems, power fluctuation, correction in autonomous drones, equilibrium modeling in emergency pressure valves. The result was the same. When the spiral's influence was introduced, the systems bent, but didn't break. They didn't collapse. They adapted, held the tension like a vine wrapping around a bent trellis. For the first time, Dale said it aloud. This isn't about oscillation. It's about how a system listens to its past. Clara received the message at 3:17 a.m., a single line from Dale. We ran it. It held. Tell him. She didn't reply. Instead, she slipped on her coat, stepped out into the night air, and walked to the old shed behind the greenhouse. Elias was already there. He wasn't surprised to see her. He didn't ask. He just looked up. Well, he said. Clara nodded. It didn't flatten. It bent and remembered. He didn't smile. But he closed his eyes for a moment, like someone hearing a familiar song return from the far edge of memory. That morning, in a closed-door meeting inside the Applied Systems Division, Dale and Clean presented their findings to Professor Judd, Chair of Systems Architecture. Judd was a man who didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight like ancient stone. He watched the simulation twice, never blinked. Then he leaned forward and asked, "Where did this come from?" Dale paused. "A student," he said. "Unofficial, not enrolled, no background, farm kid." Judd raised an eyebrow. "Name?" "Elias Walker." Silence. Then Judd stood, walked to the whiteboard, and stared at the drawn spiral. "This would invalidate at least 3 decades of stability assumptions." Clean spoke next. "Only if we insist systems must return to 0, but what if they never did?" Judd tapped the board once. then everything we built on that zero leans. Elias wasn't told about the meeting. He was back on the farm, feeding the chickens, repairing a fence post that had leaned too far to stand. He didn't know that his spiral had already started slipping into closed research documents. He didn't know that a quiet conversation had begun in the background of several national agencies. But he felt something shift. Not in the wind, in the ground. The soil was wetter than usual that week, more willing to hold shape. He walked the spiral again, barefoot. 5 loops, then stopped, and added a 6th. Not because he needed to, but because he felt the memory ask for it. Meanwhile, back at MIT, Professor Judd made one final call. Not to an academic, not to a theorist, to a policy strategist named Marcus Thorne. The man answered on the first ring. "Go ahead," Thorne said. "We found something," Judd said. "Is it useful?" "It's disruptive." Thorne smiled. "Even better." The invitation didn't come in an envelope. It was hand-delivered to Clara by a courier wearing a suit too sharp for campus grounds. Thick paper, no logo. Embossed text. Closed-door review session. Location, State Science Initiative Building, 14th floor. Participants, Applied Systems Oversight Board, plus select observers. Subject, Emerging Frameworks in System Memory and Rotational Adaptation. Presenter, C. Whitmore, on behalf of external contributor. Clara read it twice, then once more, aloud. On behalf of external contributor. They didn't name Elias. They wouldn't. Not in the building where nothing unnamed was allowed to exist. She called him that night. The wind behind his voice told her he was still on the farm. "They want you to speak," she said, "but they won't say it out loud." Elias didn't answer right away. Then, "Are they asking what the spiral means?" Clara paused. "No," she said. "They're asking if it's allowed." The 14th floor was colder than the rest of the building. Glass walls, leather chairs, metal nameplates, and a long rectangular table that looked more like a courtroom than a place of research. No one wore a lab coat. Everyone wore suits. And in the center of the room, projected on the wall, the spiral. Cleaned, labeled, abstracted, but still breathing. Barely. Clara stood beside Elias as the committee filed in. 8 people, 4 with pens, 3 with screens, 1, Marcus Thorne, with nothing but a memory and a smirk. He spoke first. "Thank you for coming," he said without looking up. "Let's begin." The presentation lasted 13 minutes. No charts, no click-through slides, just Clara, voice even, walking through the spiral's rhythm, the way it carried memory and curvature, the way it refused to return to an arbitrary center, and the way systems that followed it did not collapse. At minute 14, a woman in a navy jacket raised her hand. Sharp eyes, tighter jaw. "We understand the behavior, but where is the control?" Clara answered, "It adapts without symmetry." "That's not an answer." Elias stepped forward. "It bends," he said, "but it doesn't break." The room turned to him for the first time. One man frowned. "Are you a doctoral candidate?" "No," Elias said. "Are you academically affiliated?" "No." The woman leaned back. "Then who gave you permission to rethink gravity?" No one spoke, until Clara said softly, "Permission isn't how discovery works." Another man, older, gray hair, voice calm, asked, "Is this stable enough to implement in real-world systems?" Clara nodded. "Not as a formula, as a framework." He stared at the spiral projection again. "It's messy." Elias smiled faintly. So is wind. Thorne finally stood. Let's get to the point, he said. What's at stake here? Clara's voice was steady. 3 decades of design assumptions, and the comfort of believing that all systems begin in balance. One of the men whispered to another, "This is dangerous thinking." Elias looked down at his boots, then at the spiral, and quietly said, "It's only dangerous if you think gravity owes you symmetry." After the meeting, no one shook hands. Clara and Elias rode the elevator down in silence. At the ground floor, she finally turned to him. "They're not going to disprove it," she said. "They'll try to bury it." Elias stepped out into the light, let the wind hit his face, then whispered, "That's fine. Let them bury it. I'll just plant it deeper." Back on the farm, Elias walked to the north field, dug a shallow trench with his heel, coiled rope, stepped the spiral again, 6 loops this time, then left it. Rain came that night, but the spiral didn't wash away. The ground remembered. Clara found it by accident. She wasn't looking for forgotten science. She was trying to forget it herself. 2 weeks had passed since the review on the 14th floor. The committee never followed up. No emails, no phone calls, just silence, so complete it felt calculated. Elias had gone quiet too. He stopped answering at night, stopped drawing the spiral, stopped stepping into rooms that demanded credentials before curiosity. The discovery came on a rainy Tuesday. Clara had retreated to the campus archive, where old project folders went to die. She was helping a younger student prepare for a systems history report. She pulled a dusty binder from the bottom shelf. The spine read, LEVER. Lateral Equilibrium Vector Reanalysis. Year 1999. Status, incomplete. Funding, discontinued. She almost passed it over, until she saw, scribbled on the inside flap, a single line in pencil. Stability is not balance. It is memory resisting collapse. She froze. That wasn't from a paper. That was Elias, nearly word for word, but written 2 decades before he was born. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She scanned the documents, dozens of them, graphs, simulations, partial models, notes in looping cursive from a man named Professor Alden Lyle, now long retired, rumored to have vanished from formal academia after a disagreement with MIT's Systems Division. Clara tracked him down through a university pension listing, emailed him. 2 days later, a reply arrived. "Dear Ms. Whitmore, I'm surprised anyone still remembers Lever. It wasn't shut down. It was quietly allowed to starve. If your student is seeing something, tell him to be careful. The math is real. The consequences, too." Alden Lyle. Clara printed everything, took the entire folder to the farm. Elias was in the shed repairing a broken lantern. The wind blew through a missing window pane. The air smelled like oil and old wood. She dropped the file on the workbench. He glanced up. "What's this?" She opened to the footnote, showed him the pencil scrawl. He read it, didn't blink. "They saw it," she said. "Years ago. Maybe not in a spiral, but they saw the lean, the memory, the shift." Elias turned the page. A simulation graph, one with a curve that bent just slightly before returning. Not a failure. A hesitation. They spent the next 6 nights rerunning Lyle's code, translating it line by line into modern platforms. The spiral didn't appear directly, but its shadow did, a recursive nudge in the feedback loop that mimicked memory. Not perfectly, but unmistakably. One test in particular showed the pattern, a system exposed to rotational force at random intervals. Instead of resetting, It adapted, not by resisting, but by repeating the shape of its last imbalance, almost like an instinct. Clara whispered, "This is what he was trying to prove." Elias nodded. "But he didn't walk it." She looked at him. "You did." At dawn, Clara called Professor Lyle. He didn't pick up. She left a voicemail. "You weren't alone. The spiral lived, not in a paper, in the field. It just needed someone who didn't start with balance." That evening, an email arrived. One audio file, no subject. No body, just the voice of an old man. "You have to decide, Mr. Walker, whether the spiral you carry is something to prove or something to live. Because if you try to win with it, you'll lose. But if you let it live where others won't look, it might outlast them all." Elias didn't reply. He walked to the back field, the one with the clay ridge. The spiral he'd drawn weeks before was almost gone, but some lines remained, ghost-like impressions in the earth, pressed deeper by rain and wind. He stepped into the center, not to redraw it, to listen, not to answer, to remember. That week, Clara prepared her paper. Not for a conference. For a journal no one respected enough to censor. The title wasn't elegant. Unresolved memory patterns in transitional system loops. Observational frameworks derived from field-based spiral recurrence. It sounded academic, looked formal. But at the bottom of page 17 in the footnotes, she wrote, "Pattern observed in unstructured field spiral, Walker variant. Attribution withheld by request." The journal wasn't prestigious. Its masthead was printed in grayscale. The web version had no animations. Most of its articles averaged 12 reads, half of them from the authors themselves. But that was exactly why Clara chose it. Not because no one would read it, but because no one would interfere. The Journal of Experimental Systems Modeling had a reputation for publishing what others didn't dare. Unstable frameworks, flawed but promising theories, notes from engineers who worked more with hands than equations. Its motto, printed faintly beneath each issue: "Observe first, explain second, defend only if necessary." Perfect. Clara submitted the paper at 2:14 a.m. on a Sunday. No cover letter, just the paper, and a simple checkbox ticked at the bottom: "Withhold author biography." She didn't tell Elias. He was back on the farm, walking the eastern field with a coil of rope over his shoulder, tracing a new spiral, this one wider, slower. He didn't write it down, didn't name it, because the spiral was never the point. The walking was. 4 weeks passed. Then, without warning, the journal responded. No edits requested, no feedback. Just one line: "We are pleased to publish your submission in our upcoming issue. We find the framework unusual, possibly impractical, and utterly sincere." Editorial board. Clara smiled when she read it. It wasn't praise, it was recognition. The issue went live online on the 9th of March. No press release, no Twitter storm, no interviews, just a quiet link. 12 people clicked it the first day. One of them was a mechanical systems researcher in Vermont. Another was an agricultural modeling student in Alberta. A third was a city planner in rural Japan, working on flood response architecture. None of them knew each other. All of them saw the same thing. This spiral doesn't seek balance. It listens to how the world bends, and bends with it. Clara didn't track the views. She didn't cite herself. She didn't correct the small typo on page 6, but she printed a copy, placed it in a simple envelope, and mailed it to the Walker farm. No note, no explanation, just the paper, folded, stamped, real. Elias didn't open it right away. He let it sit for a day, then another. Finally, one morning after mending the chicken wire fence behind the barn, He sat on the porch and unfolded the journal pages, read every word, slowly, then flipped to the final footnote. Pattern observed in unstructured field spiral, Walker variant. Attribution withheld by request. He didn't smile, but he felt something ease in his chest. Not pride, relief. Like something had finally landed, not on a podium, but on solid earth. That afternoon, Elias didn't draw a new spiral. He sat instead in the grass, bare feet pressed against the dirt, and for the first time in months, he closed his eyes, not to escape the world, but to hear it move again. The breeze rustled the trees, the soil warmed beneath the sun, and somewhere deep in the roots beneath him, the memory of every spiral he'd ever walked held. Elsewhere, 3 citations appeared. Tiny references in larger studies, energy feedback systems, adaptive control theory, erosion modeling and rotational agriculture. None of them mentioned Elias. None needed to. Because the idea had already left his name behind. It was now a shape in other people's minds, a question too gentle to debate, a curve too familiar to ignore. They called it different things: spiral memory logic, Walker model, unverified, field responsive oscillation, deviation. But it always meant the same thing. What if systems don't return because they remember? That spring, Clara declined her PhD offer. She chose a small research station in Vermont. No media, no title, just weathered barns, field sensors, and a gravel road that curved ever so slightly toward the edge of a forest. On her first day, she taught 5 undergrads how to trace deviation in irrigation flow using chalk lines and hay bales. One of them asked, "What if it's not symmetrical?" Clara smiled. Then maybe it's finally telling the truth. The first person to redraw the spiral without knowing its origin was a 15-year-old girl in Rajasthan, India. Her father irrigated dry fields by hand. She noticed that if he carved his ditches in straight lines, the water pooled and died. But when she curved the furrows inward, loop by loop, the soil stayed damp longer. It wasn't scientific. It was survival. She traced the pattern once, then again, then sketched it in the corner of her school book. Her teacher didn't know what it was, called it doodles. But somewhere in Vermont, Clara saw the sketch, shared online by a non-profit studying rural water resilience. Her heart stopped, because it wasn't exact, but it didn't have to be. The spiral had left the chalkboard. It had become instinct. Months passed. Then a thesis appeared in a Norwegian institute. Adaptive feedback from recurring instability, a model for coastal wind turbines. The author never cited Elias, didn't even know his name, but the math, the wobble built into the structure, followed the same rhythm. An oscillation that did not suppress deviation but instead learned from it. Deviation as memory, the paper read. Not error, but history. Elias never saw the paper, but the land he walked had already whispered that line to him years before. In southern Brazil, a group of young architects redesigned a hillside school using curves instead of corners. When asked why, their lead designer shrugged. "Straight lines, crack. These shapes bend." When the journalist asked if this was a new design philosophy, she answered, "No, just old wisdom that somehow feels new again." She didn't know she had just paraphrased Elias's entire life. Meanwhile, back at the Walker farm, nothing changed. Not in a way the world could measure. Elias built a new shed using leftover fence wood, taught a neighbor boy how to fix a rusted hinge, repaired a broken irrigation pipe using wire and old belts. One morning, he walked the spiral again, not for research, not for proof, but because the earth still held room for questions. He didn't write anything down, but Clara did. She still kept a private notebook, pages full of fragments. Spiral doesn't repeat, it recalls. What bends will hold, if it's allowed to. Maybe gravity isn't a pull. Maybe it's just memory in motion. At a small conference in Oregon, a systems engineer cited Clara's paper, not with reverence, but with curiosity. Walker-type memory, he called it. Still experimental, but oddly self-aware. No one asked where it came from. They were too busy wondering where it might go. Back at the farm, Elias's father had taken to sitting on the porch longer these days, not watching anything in particular, just listening to the wind curve around the barn. He turned to Elias one evening and said, "Funny thing about that spiral. You didn't carve it in the world. You carved it in people." Elias didn't answer, just nodded. Because he knew something now. Something he hadn't known back when he first tied that piece of rope to a rusted bolt and traced a shape in the dirt. Some ideas are too honest to stay yours. They slip into someone else's field. Change how someone digs a ditch, how they write code, how they listen to systems that others gave up on. And they never ask for credit. Only continuance. Spring came early that year. The soil on the Walker farm turned dark before April, not from rain, but from remembrance. The kind of dampness that doesn't soak the ground but softens it, makes it easier to leave a mark. Elias felt it in his boots before he saw it. He stood one morning at the edge of the western field, nothing in his hands, no rope, no tools, just a quiet in his chest he hadn't felt in months. Behind him, the barn leaned a little more. Ahead, the horizon curved like the edge of a whisper. Clara arrived just before noon. No announcement, no message beforehand. Just a knock on the old screen door and the familiar creak of her bike chain outside. Elias met her on the porch. "You're early," he said. "The data didn't wait," she replied. They didn't say more. Instead, they walked. Across the field, through the tall grass, past the rusted gate he'd fixed by hand last fall. Clara paused at the edge of the clearing. She saw it instantly. The spiral, not drawn in dirt, not etched with chalk, planted. The field had bloomed, not in rows but in curves. Clover and rye sprouting along arcs, looping inward, tighter and tighter until the center nearly vanished beneath the green. She turned to Elias. "You grew it?" He nodded. "Didn't plan to, just dropped the seed along the line I walked." She stepped forward, hands brushing the tops of the clover. "It remembered," she whispered. Elias looked out across the land. "No," he said softly. It continued. That night, back in town, a young teacher at the vocational school asked Elias to speak. Not at the university. At the mechanics wing, where 12 students gathered in oil-stained coveralls, half of them tired, 2 of them asleep before the session began. Elias didn't bring a slideshow. He didn't bring notes. He brought a coil of rope and a length of twine. He dropped it on the floor, drew a small spiral with his boots. Then he said, "Most systems don't break all at once. They bend first, then they pretend they're fine. Then they forget how they bent." One student raised a hand. "So, how do you fix it?" Elias smiled. "Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just teach it how to remember the bend and hold it." Another student laughed. "You teaching therapy or engineering?" Elias shrugged. "Both." Months passed. No news, no fame, no awards. But one day, someone on a systems design forum asked, "Whatever happened to that spiral logic thing, the one with the feedback wobble?" Replies were scattered. "Dead theory. No recent papers." too poetic to be practical. But someone shared a photo, no caption, no name, just a field, with a spiral of clover, still growing. Elias never answered that thread. He never saw the replies, because he didn't check. He was too busy fixing a leak in the barn roof, replacing the hinges on the coop door, sharpening the blade of a scythe that hadn't been used in years. The spiral lived, and that was enough. Years later, a minor journal on rural economies published a paper titled Spiral Memory as a Model for Adaptive Recovery in Agricultural Systems. It had charts, equations, a conclusion that read, while difficult to model, such spirals suggest a form of equilibrium not defined by return, but by remembered stress. It cited no one. It didn't have to. The last spiral Elias ever drew was behind the barn, 5 loops, wide at the edge, tight toward the center. No seed planted, no study attached. Just dirt, just shape, just memory. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Elias walked the curve slowly, barefoot, not to calculate, not to test, to say goodbye, to the system, to the silence, to the world he had bent, ever so slightly, with nothing more than rope, earth, and a question. Some people aren't born to take the stage. They're born to plant something, in soil no one notices. Elias never stood beneath applause. He didn't break records, didn't publish best-selling theories, but he left behind something more enduring, a quiet spiral, drawn in the land, and in the minds of those still enough to see it. This story isn't about genius. It's about stillness, about ideas that don't need microphones, only hands, about boys no one listened to until the ground did. So if you've ever carried a truth you didn't know how to explain, if you've ever walked a path no one else could see, if you've ever felt out of place in a world of straight lines, then remember this: not every truth needs to be shouted. Some truths only ask to be walked. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the final lines of this story. Maybe you're a little like me, someone who's walked through life carrying thoughts that never had names and questions no one ever paused to hear. But you know, even if no one mentions us, even if they never quote us, even if they don't say our names right, if what we plant is true, it will grow, quietly, but steadfast.